Okay. I'm Jeremy Poynting. I'm the founding and manager editor of Peepal Press. That began 34 and odd years ago. We're now the largest publisher of Caribbean fiction, poetry, anywhere in the world, at least in the English-speaking world. And we've published around about 450 books over that period. We publish both fiction and poetry and academic non-fiction, memoirs. We do around 20 books a year, and that's the basic thing. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to know, how exactly did you get involved in Caribbean writing itself?
Probably through a kind of a mixture of political interests, musical interests, acquaintances. I mean, when I was at Leeds University, this is over 50 years ago, you understand, that Leeds was a much more kind of diverse university at that kind of time. I mean, there were Commonwealth students were able to attend the university without paying fees.
Oh, wow.
Well, nobody paid fees. So the university attracted substantial numbers of students from Africa, Caribbean, and so on. One of the people who I got to know really well at the university was the Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and he was a good deal older than I was, but we formed quite a friendship. And he was doing work. He was doing an MA at the time, and working on people like C.L.R. James, George Lamming, and so on. And I got an interest. I was interested in African writing. I was interested in everything except perhaps English writing at that kind of stage. I was politically kind of very motivated. I mean, one of the things that kind of led me towards that kind of interest in the Indian presence in the Caribbean was, I was a student member of the Communist Party at that time. It was quite a respectable thing to do at that kind of point. And the Communist Party headquarters were in town over the market, and they had little dusty kind of rooms. It was really great people. And I found a copy of Chedi Jagan's book, The West on Trial, and read that. And so that book sort of opened up a whole lot of other things. One, that the Caribbean was much more diverse in its kinds of origin, so that big Indian presence in Trinidad and Guyana was one thing. It was also kind of reinforcing that sense that Britain as an imperial nation wasn't really dead in any kind of sense, that it was only kind of sort of 14, 15 years before, when the British had sent in troops into Guyana to overthrow a legitimately elected government. So I was part of a kind of a student consciousness which was anti-colonial. I remember kind of researching stuff about the British in Aden. So you recognise that, from a quite early stage, that kind of intimate and difficult relationship between Britain and the Caribbean that goes back 400 years, but was continuing, although Britain really wanted to forget about it. So that was the kind of way into thinking of being very interested in the writing and so on. And after this would be about around 1970 or something, I started doing an MPhil. Part-time. I was teaching in further education at the time, and what the MPhil became, really, it sort of grew into being an MPhil about looking at the Indian presence in the Caribbean through literature. So it was both about how other people in the Caribbean, whether they were white, African, or whatever, saw the Indian presence, and it was about how Indians were writing about themselves and how that presence was transforming itself. And this eventually turned into a PhD thesis. It took me a hell of a long time. It took 12 years to finish it because I was teaching full time all the time. Mm-hmm. But it was about, so there were different motivations in it. There were things, one was getting grasp of the fact that, I mean, in a sense, the Caribbean has been a kind of an important kind of experimental chamber where all the kind of things that societies now really have to come to terms with and work out how to deal with. The Caribbean have been dealing with that for 300 or 400 years. So that the kind of the fact of that Indian presence and how people negotiated relationships in places like Trinidad or Guyana was struck me as very interesting. It was also about the kind of sense that you could, I mean, you read sort of distinguished profs writing about V.S. Naipaul, and they obviously assumed that the kind of Trinidad or the Indian thing that Naipaul wrote about was the only one that was there, or that that Naipaul's view of it was the same as any other kind of point of view. So I mean, part of it was actually was involved about going to the Caribbean and doing some library research, but also kind of just hanging out and sort of So I spent quite a long time in Trinidad, quite a long time in Guyana, just talking to people and sort of getting a view of different kinds of perspectives within within the Indian communities, getting a sense of to what extent kind of that for instance Indian culture was changing and recognising there was no such thing as any kind of thing like a single Indian Caribbean, as there was no such thing like as a single African Caribbean. In other words, there were kind of culture wars going on within each of those groups, between tradition, modernity, class wars. So one of the things in Guyana was that there was a kind of group who were very much who embraced the notion of coolie-dom, so coolie culture, because what they recognised was that perhaps the authentic Indian culture that was in Guyana was a creolised one. It was one that had grown up in contact, so that although by and large, people tend to live ethnically separately in Guyana, there are nevertheless always places where there's a kind of rubbing together of contacts. The sugar plantation was always a place where there was a degree of kind of cross-cultural things. So the Indians would tend to be the field workers. There was a kind of an African majority who tended to work in the sugar factories, but nevertheless, you could see things like folklore passed between them, knowledge of local kind of herbs and things that you could do with herbs. Of course, ganja passed between them. The Indians were responsible for bringing ganja to the Caribbean, and its popularity thereafter. So it was about finding out. It was about finding out that there were lots of different ways in which Indians saw themselves. So that you saw. To start with, there were always kinds of distinctions. The Indian presence in both places included a significant Muslim minority, but it was at that point a Muslim minority which was culturally very Indian. They came from they were the Muslims who came from the same villages and were recruited from the same villages. So although there were separations and things, you'd find a village and things where there was both a temple and a mosque, and the Muslims made up about 15%. Then kind of a significant minority of Indians converted to Christianity, because it was the only way in the early stages of gaining access to education. So for instance, there were very important people called the Canadian missions, Presbyterians from Canada, who brought a mission very specifically to the Indians. They weren't interested in anybody else, and they were the ones who set up schools. But they gave primary schooling to anybody who could go into them, but they wouldn't let anybody into the secondary schools unless they were converts. So there were a significant number of kind of the early kind of professionals that came through that Christian mission kind of thing. So with obvious kinds of cultural kinds of transformations and so on. There were, people came from different parts of India, so that the majority came through Calcutta and from central India, but there was also a minority who came from Madras and were Tamil speakers, with quite different kinds of cultural kind of things. So it was getting to grips with all that kind of variation and things, and then putting all that into relationship to, I suppose I think the Caribbean is still essentially Eurocentric, but putting it into context with that, putting it into context with the attempts of African Caribbeans to sort of work out some kind of sense of where they were in relationship both to Africa and to Europe, how the Indians fitted into all that, and getting to grips with the fact that in both places there were the elements of friction. Guyana is still separated on ethnic lines. Guyana's progress has been stymied by the fact that African Indians don't trust each other, and they both people vote for parties which pursue their own interests. So that was the beginnings of it. Then that was, as I say, the thesis took quite a long time. Completed it in the end, and one of the kinds of consequences, or one of the kinds of things that came out of that, getting to know people, visiting people, staying with people, finding out what people were writing, because one of the things that I was interested in was not just in a sense like the really good literature, the Naipals, the Ismith Khans and things,
the well-knowns,
the well-knowns, but I was interested in what people were doing in people who were writing, sending stories to the newspapers, stuff that was being published locally. I mean, I remember there was a guy in Guyana called Sheikh Sadiq who had a little printing press, and he self-published, when rode round Georgetown on his bicycle selling his books. So it was looking at all that range of different kind of ways of using writing to explore a sense of identity. But but in the process, I kind of you identified some real writers who were not getting published. So one of the very first things after I'd finished the thesis, and I suppose there was a hollow in my life at that point, and part of that was thinking, well, okay, there were a couple of books of people that I knew about who couldn't get published. Guyana at that point was in the worst state of any place in the Caribbean. It was it had engaged in a kind of depends on how you look at it, but it engaged in an experiment in state socialism, which hadn't worked. It had, but one which was totally ethnically kind of biased. It had got involved itself in rigged elections and exclusions. So it had fallen apart economically. When you went to Guyana, you had to take a suitcase full of food and things to help. You couldn't get paper. It survived Guyana survived only on black market smuggling. So there was no way these books could get done there. The first book I did was written in a kind of a deepish Guyanese Creole, which I knew no kind of English publisher would have grasped. So that was the very first book, called Back Down People. Okay. And one, you mentioned your interest in Creole. I mean, one of the experiences that I had I used to stay with this guy called Rupal Mona, whose first book was the author of Back Down People, and he'd grown up on a sugar estate. He was one of the few people who kind of escaped into, he'd done a few O-levels and stuff. His mother had worked on the estate. His mother was retired, and we'd have his mother was a great person, but she didn't understand standard English, I couldn't understand what she was saying. So we'd have these conversations. Mo and I would sit in the middle, his mother would sit on one side, I'd sit on the other, I'd say something, he'd translate it into Creole. And she was speaking a basilect of Guyanese Creole, but one that was also kind of very Hindified. So there were a lot of Hindi words in it and so on. And I mean, when we did that book, I realised that people outside Ghana, or even people outside the Indian community, wouldn't understand some of the words in it because they were Hindi words that had been Creolised and stuff. So we did it not genuinely in agreement with glossaries and things, but we did one for that one. So that was that. It was that beginning, and I suppose then the other thing comes. Then my finishing the thesis, acquiring quite a lot of contacts with writers and things, coincided with the point where big changes in British publishing were taking place. So the sort of 70s and 80s were periods where that gradually the large number of sort of medium-sized independents were being bought up, and there was an agglomeration of things. So if you look at the kind of people who were publishing the Caribbean writing of the 60s and 70s, none of them exist now. That they, apart Faber is about the only one, or that they exist as kind of tiny little kind of imprints within some big giant corporation. So one of the things that was happening is at that point, Heinemann had both a Caribbean and an African writers series. They killed the African writers series dead because clearly it wasn't making money, and they pulled back on. So they stopped doing new books in the Caribbean writers series. They kept in print only those books really that were kind of on the school's syllabus or were on the university syllabus and so on. So I thought there is a niche there. There's a hole there. And, I mean, obviously, after a bit you realise why Heinemann and Longman was also in that. Why they pulled out, because it's economically a very difficult area. The market is small. The process of selling books in the Caribbean is difficult. So, but anyway, there was that space, and I decided that Peepal Tree would engage in that space.
Okay.
I perhaps would just add to that is the other important part of the context is things like New Beacon Books. So do you want me to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
We're
ready.
Okay.
Ready.
Yeah. So I mean, to say the other kind of factors are, whilst some of the kind of bigger companies were kind of withdrawing, there was the example of a number of important Black British companies beginning the process. So there'd been New Beacon there, and I'd known. I mean, John LaRose was kind of like an unofficial kind of supervisor of my thesis. He'd tell me all sorts of stuff about Trinidad that wasn't in the books or anything, and was very, he was very supportive and we were good friends, and also with the Huntleys in the Bogle Uberjaw bookshop. So I used to make regular kind of trips to London, and you'd look to find the books that you wanted in their two shops. But it was also kind of that thing where you recognise, and there were other people like, I think it was Buzz Johnson with Carrier Press, and you recognised that you didn't have to be big to actually publish important books, and so that there was a demystification of the thing, so that you recognised early on that John LaRose once said to me, look, any fool can publish a book. You've got to have a bit of brains to sell it, right? So, you recognise there are different kind of stages in the thing. You've got to make the right kind of choices about thinking about which books are important. You've got to make sure books are in the best kind of shape they can be. Editing, has always been a very important part of the process. But then you've got to think about how you're going to sell the books. And I mean, one of the kinds of moments of when I knew that something was happening was when I actually managed to sell more books to New Beacon than I was buying from them.
Okay.
that was there. So yeah, go on. You had a question.
Actually, I'll leave it till later. But what I wanted to ask in terms of starting off, you've just talked about like trying to sell the books. But what was it like initially running the publishers? What are your most vivid early memories?
Okay. The first, probably for the first 7 or 8 years, it was just me, and it was doing it from home. It was doing it, from the spare bedroom. It was doing it. It eventually grew into the garage, because I kind of worked out that I could do very few books because printers' bills were so high. So why, so I had it was a very friendly printer at Leeds, and he said, look, I'll sell you my own machine. So we learned how to use that printing press, and that meant that the cost of doing books dropped by a fifth or something. So basically you're paying for ink and paper. It was a bit of a struggle, and there were sort of things like, so our garage turned into a little printing, not a big garage, but so it had an old offset litho press. I mean, this is pre-digital, you understand. It had a folding machine, and I can remember well, my wife says, you lay on the floor and you made me put paper to see which way, because you had to work out how to set it properly. You had to work out what the path of the paper was. I was lying on the thing, watching this paper shoot past.
Now you might just stick a mobile phone under there and record it.
Yeah. Slow it down, exactly.
Right,
Yeah. So, we began in totally pre-digital days, but I think right from the start, I kind of think I had a sense of what books were important. And there was a huge gulf. I mean, I can talk a bit about why literary publishing has never taken off in the Caribbean, and that's a significant fact. But because of that fact, then people in the Caribbean suddenly think, oh God, there's this madman in England who's publishing Caribbean books. let's send our stuff to him. So but I'd also been involved sort of academically. I mean, the fact that I'd done this thesis on Indians in the Caribbean meant that I went to conferences in the Caribbean. So there were most of the sort of people at UE in particularly in Trinidad at the University of Guyana, I knew lots of people then. So the people, so there was that kind of thing where people knew you existed, and that you were perhaps the one chance of actually something happening. Because New Beacon did brilliant stuff, but again, it was one part of what they did, and obviously that they could probably manage 3 or 4 books a year, but that was it. So that was very much the kind of first 7 or 8 years. It was a small number of books a year. But the crucial thing for me was, I think, that kind of was acquiring a printing press, because you saw lots of other small publishers, small poetry publishers, and they got stuck in that thing of doing 1 or 2 books a year, and then having to wait until they got some money back, and then perhaps being able to do another one. So the things were very slow off the ground. But once we got the press, then you could do more. You could do more books a year, and you brought your unit cost really right down. It was a sweat and a struggle, and I wasn't a natural printer in any sense of the term, but that was the model that we. For instance, we were doing some quite important books. We did Eric Roach's collected poems, which was the first thing. We were working with Ken Ramchand at the University of West Indies in Trinidad. But we got, I think, we'd come to the attention of the Arts Council of what we were doing. So when I applied, I kind of was encouraged to say, well, put in a bid for some money for doing. So we got some money for doing, like say 6 books, and then. Again, I think we were impressed by the fact that we actually delivered the books, and they were good books, and so on. And then round about 91, 92, the Arts Council came up with this scheme, I think it was. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was kind of focused on trying to encourage very small publishers to grow, and I think it was targeted very specifically at people who were doing either Black British books, Caribbean books, and I think there was, for instance, there was an there's somebody who was a British Indian, British Asian, who was involved, and that it was quite, it was quite generous, to produce all these business plans and things for it. But it won that. So in 91, 92, we got sort of quite generous funding from the arts. I think it was about 18 grand a year, which in those days was a lot. The business plan was naive. And then you realise that nobody really at the Arts Council knew anything much about business either. But but the plan was essentially what we would do. We would set up two companies, one a publishing company, one a printing company. But in the end it worked just about. But there were periods where there were huge difficulties with printing machinery. I wasn't trained as a printer. Things got better when I managed to recruit somebody in who'd been made redundant from Leeds Other Paper, who came in with some printing skills. And for a bit we managed to run a kind of a fairly decent small printing operation, where we printed books for the small publishers. We did things for local kind of social organisations. The home workers were one of the people used to do a lot of stuff for, and I think perhaps people liked the fact that we. I think that they found that particularly women found that they were treated properly here, and that we didn't kind of bamboozle people with sort of printing science and so on, and that we were sympathetic to the things they were doing. So that kind of lasted for a bit. I mean, there was a period where we were heavily indebted to the bank. We had the lights turned off, with electricity cut off at some point, with the bailiffs in. So there was a difficult kind of period. But in the end, that kind of model began to work. So we were doing perhaps 7 or 8 books a year. Beginning to acquire a bit more kind of reputation for that. One of the important things that happened at that point was that Hannah came along. Hannah Bannister there came along, and I mean she came initially as part of a kind of job training scheme. This is in the early 90s, high undergraduate unemployment and stuff. But the attraction was, they told me that she could spell, and they told me that she came with a computer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we had it, but it wasn't a very modern one.
Mm-hmm.
So then Hannah stayed, and kind of we then began to put things on a much more even keel. And so that she, I mean, one of the things that one of my friends who we publish said, that Peepal Tree has run on pathological optimism for a long time. But so that one of the things that that Hannah brought was kind of organisation, common sense, keeping feet on the ground, and so on, and then really beginning to develop the kind of marketing side of books, which, despite John LaRose's kind of instruction, was always the kind of perhaps the bit that was least well developed in that. Again, remember this is a period before the internet, and so on and so on. But I think one of the things that has been part of our survival and things is that we were always very early adopters of those new technologies. We were using the internet and email almost as soon as it was kind of really available. Mm-hmm. We migrated to do it, using digital kind of technologies for print as soon as they were, and if they were outrageously expensive. So we were always kind of trying to make the technical side of life more effective, more efficient, and that that was part of hanging in there. The Arts Council, after that period ended, the Arts Council ceased funding us, because then they kind of they dispersed the organisation from being a national one to being a regional one, but no money followed that. So I mean, so we had to survive on our own 2 feet for quite a long time, and that that teaches you. So in the end, you learn by painful error. Even it's how to run a business. How to manage credit control and all that kind of stuff. So we found a kind of equilibrium. We paid off our debts gradually to the bank. The bank got off our back eventually, and then I think at the point where the Arts Council saw, no, actually they're surviving. I think they were convinced that we'd just go bust and stuff, that we were surviving. Then we were invited to apply for regular funding, and that happened round about 2006, I think. Mm-hmm. And one of the kinds of consequences of that was it began to enable, because there was as well as the money we were earning from selling books, but there was also a kind of a dwindling amount of money we were earning from selling print, because obviously things like people started using the internet for websites for their organisations rather than doing newsletters. Printers who were able to get into the digital market, were beginning to get cheaper, do better colour and so on, and we couldn't really afford. Well, we had to make a decision: were we going to try and get into that market or not? And we decided that no, that's not what we're about at all. It was a means to an end, and that what we really wanted to do was to concentrate totally on our publishing. So the Arts Council funding helped that, and also the other thing that helped that was perhaps crucial, was that we kind of suddenly realised that our backlist was actually generating a decent enough kind of income. So books the books that were sitting in the cellar were actually generating 20-30 grand a year or something.
Okay.
Without really, apart from sending them out, without really having to do anything more about it. And it's that is the crucial thing I think often about where small independent publishers in the end get somewhere, that they're able to build up a kind of significant backlist that people continue to be interested in. So with that, then we took the decision. This is perhaps about 10 years ago, maybe longer. I mean, I think that we would cease printing, and that we would send all our books out to be printed, and that's been the situation for the last dozen years or so. And it meant that we were able to do more books a year. It meant that we were able to keep significant books in print. It meant that we were able to solve the problem of storage of books. I mean, our cellar is rammed with books. You see in the middle floor, which is rammed with books. And that was when we'd only done about 200 books. So we'd have needed a place about 10 times bigger to hold it. So the way of working through a digital printer means that you only need to kind of get the number of books printed that you want at that point, and then you just replenish as you go on. So we can just send them we need another 200 of this. We've got them within the week, and that's made a big difference too. And I think it's generally how most of the smaller independents work, using those kinds of print technologies. But it is so much easier to make books than it used to be.
About in terms of how supportive has your family been? Because this is something that you kind of sprung upon them, or I would say, or maybe that's not the term you would like to use, but how supportive have they been?
Very. I mean, very in the sense that in the sense of not in the sense of kind of direct involvement. Although my son spent a year before he went to university helping me, but it just in the sense of being allowed to do it. That, so that the fact that for a long time, when I was doing my thesis, I would be otherwise engaged. When the big early days of Peepal Tree, it was often a 7-day-a-week kind of thing, and sometimes you'd have to come in on Sundays, and it wasn't popular, but it was it was accepted and things. So I mean that, and I think so that there's both there's an appreciation of that it's been something that's been important to do, an acknowledgement that it's seen as being valued by other people, and in the end it's what it's what my dad does or what my husband does, and there are sometimes there are tensions, when anybody in any kind of thing has some kind of overwhelming kind of focus, so that you can you can sometimes, like, you'd be on holiday and your wife would say, put that damn bit of editing away, let's go for a walk somewhere or something, and so it's so it's that thing between being supported, tolerated, sometimes kind of fought against things, but yes, no, I mean that family support was crucial, and at a very crucial stage when we were struggling in money terms. My son, who he started working for Price Waterhouse. He said to me, "Dad, you taught me everything I need to know about money," which was go somewhere and earn it, where you're going to earn good money. So he lent us the money at a crucial point, and I mean the other kind of basic thing that helped to stabilise stuff. I mean, Peepal Tree began as, well, it was me. It was a sole trader thing. Then it was a couple of partnerships. Then the partnerships both broke apart on the tensions of kind of difficulty. And one of the things I published 2 poets in the Caribbean who were also very significant. They're good poets, but they're also significant businessmen. And they said, "We'll help you, but we'll only help you if you turn yourself into a PLC. You've got to turn yourself into a limited liability company, and then we'll help you to we'll help to raise them." So nobody put in a huge amount, but they kind of organised. I mean, we were recognised at that stage as being about the only place where Caribbean literature and poetry was being published. Except for the really big names, the Walcotts and things. So we'd become important. Our survival became important. So that I think the Bank of Jamaica is one of our shareholders. And
okay,
wow. and very, not much. I mean, it's only about $1,000 or so. It was a grand, but at that point, a crucial amount of money came in that helped to stabilise us. And I think again, sort of running as the kind of whole ways you've got to run as a kind of limited company, there are tighter kind of accounting kind of things. Meant we had to get much more up to speed on sort of managing that financial side of things.
Okay, in your opinion, because you've been doing this for so long, why do you think that there's actually not many publishers in the Caribbean itself that are publishing locally? Like you said, there's imprints, but there's not many.
Well, no, the imprints I talk about were kind of the largely London-based publishers.
Okay.
Who disappeared. I mean, for instance, like Andre Deutsch doesn't exist anymore. Andre Deutsch was the publisher of V.S. Naipaul, Michael Anthony, and quite a significant number of important early, sort of those 60s and 70s Caribbean writers. Somebody bought it up because Andre Deutsch also had the rights to Manchester United's publishing.
Okay, wow.
That was worth a hell of a lot more than anything else. So Andre Deutsch just got asset stripped. So that was the kind of process. The Caribbean I mean, the problems of the Caribbean are both a geography, politics, cultural centres of gravity.
Okay.
Right. So, I mean, there have been. I mean, there have been a number of attempts. I mean, there was a thing called Pioneer Press in Jamaica, and that was late 40s, early 50s. And I think they got to about 15, 16 books before they ran out. And they did some interesting books, largely Jamaican, but one or two things beyond that. There were significant small magazines. So there was BIM in Barbados, there was Kike Overall in Guyana, there was Focus in Jamaica. We do that many things, but there was kind of, and then there was Caribbean Quarterly, which started, I think, in the kind of about 1960, and has kept on publishing ever since. There were important things like Jamaica Journal, which still continues, but the kind of thing to attempt to set up anything that had a kind of a literary focus has never really got off the ground. There are important. There are two significant publishers in the Caribbean. There's the University of West Indies Press, but they publish largely academic books, and scarcely any literature they do is largely kind of mates stuff. Somebody who's on the staff there that gets there you go. And then there's Ian Randall things who ran from Jamaica, who was he was a proper publisher by training. I mean, he was part of Longman and then took over. Was it Longman? But anyway, took over their kind of thing and converted it into his own. But always had a very shrewd eye for buying rights for things, putting together the kinds of anthologies and collections that the university wanted. So he's been important, but again, he never really. He might have done 2 or 3 kind of things. Again, things where they were friends of his and so on. So and I think that was in part a recognition that in general the market for literature was too small in the Caribbean, and none of the Caribbean publishers like UE Press or Randall have really cracked the business, and it's not their fault, but it have cracked the business of being able to get significant distribution outside the Caribbean, and that's one of the hard bits. They do have, but you'd be lucky to find any books by UE Press or Randall in bookshops, except like New Beacon and things like that. The kind of root kind of, the problem of course is that in quite a lot of places, the actual reading public, the public who buys books, is small. So if you think about somewhere like St Lucia has a population of 150,000 or something. Grenada has a population much the same. St Lucia doesn't currently have a bookshop.
Yeah, I realised that when I went there.
But which doesn't prevent there being, and St Lucia actually has probably one of the best records of local self-publishing. But anyway, there is a significant number of books that have been published, mostly quite small, mostly kind of that disappear quite quickly, and that's one of the so that books are kind of sold around in the one bookshop that was there. They're sold at events and things like that. And probably 300 copies made, and then the book disappears. So there is a significant and sort of courageous kind of tradition of self-publishing and small-scale publishing, but one that's scarce, that very rarely gets outside the particular island. And none of which is helped by the fact that there is a unhelpful insularity that kind of means that in by and large Jamaican bookshops are not interested in any books other than by Jamaicans. And that's all. So there's only perhaps a handful. There's a tremendously good bookshop in Port of Spain, Trinidad, connected to the Bocas, paper-based. who does have the idea that the book selling should be regional, and will hold a good regional stock. There's another heroic bookseller in Georgetown, Lloyd Austin, who's now well into his 80s. But you go into his bookshop, he has books from right across the region. But elsewhere you'd go in, you'd find a shelf of kind of local publications, and they'd be from Barbados in the Barbados, or Jamaica in Jamaica, and so on. So part of the thing is about persuading booksellers that there is a readership there who might be interested in books from Trinidad and Jamaica, or vice versa, or so on. And the other thing then is, there's no, for geographic reasons and kind of its cost of transport, there is really no kind of network of movement of books. It's cheaper to print books here and send them to different places in the Caribbean than it is to produce a book in the Caribbean and send it across the Caribbean, because transport costs are so high, and because there often aren't actual direct kind of connections. I always use this thing about when we did a conference in St Lucia, big conference, Acklal's conference, and we wanted to bring Eddie Bohr, who we'd just done a book by, who's a top Jamaican poet, to bring in from Jamaica to St Lucia, and we had to take him he had to go to Miami, fly from Miami to Barbados, and then from Barbados to St Lucia.
The story of my life.
Right. So there just isn't those kinds of direct connect. And people like artists, so that if you're trying to get an exhibition somewhere, just transporting art around is kind of prohibitively expensive and things. And so that ever since kind of federation was blown out of the water in '58, federal institutions, which the Caribbean desperately needs as far as I can see, have been very, very weak. Probably the West Indian cricket team is about the only genuinely sort of federal kind of institution. There's CARICOM, parked down and doing its best, but struggling with the fact that kind of local, national governments don't pay their dues to it and that sort of thing. Sort of struggling that. So there's a real kind of difficulty, and there are people in the Caribbean who are attempting to get publishing things off the ground. We're trying to work with somebody in Jamaica called Tanya Batson Savage, who's got a sparky little press called Blouse and Skirt, and they're trying to, but it's that struggle to get beyond that 2 or 3 books a year. It's that struggle to get the books distributed somewhere else. There's we one of the things we were involved in. There was it's been probably the most significant things that have added something to the whole mix have been the literary festivals. So that Calabash in Jamaica, Bocas in Trinidad have both, BIM has done, Barbados has done one, but those have been important in actually bringing writers from across the region together. They've been important in giving Caribbean writing a profile, so that there's a Bocas Literature Prize, which people are really keen on winning. And Bocas does the kind of the shrewd thing that as well as invite significant opinion formers from the UK. So they like one year they'll invite the literary editor of the Guardian, another year they'll invite the woman who's boss of what's the poetry thing,
National Director of National Poetry.
Yeah. And then they come in and think, God, they obviously they don't know about any of this stuff before. They bloody hell, but where are all these writers doing such tremendous stuff, and
it's exciting.
Yeah.
It's they genuinely realise that.
Yeah, and one of the the other, and it does us good because then they say, well, who's publishing all these people?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so that suddenly the Guardian said, Guardian becomes a friend.
Okay.
They said we can only review 1 or 2 books a year, but always keep us on because in the end you sometimes you send book reviews out, but you don't send them out with any great hope that anybody's going to do it. But so that you get some attention in that kind of way.
Okay. Are there any gaps, do you think, in Caribbean writing? The reason why I asked that is because I read a book and it was called Redemption in Indigo.
Right.
And it was by Karen Lord, who's a Barbadian writer.
Yeah.
And what I liked about that book is that's not the type of style of writing I've seen come out of the Caribbean much, in terms of it was like a science fiction type of writing. And I was like, I wonder if there's any areas of writing that the Caribbean still hasn't really explored that much. Is that something that's come to your mind? Yeah,
I think it's happening. I think if you'd surveyed Caribbean writing through perhaps up to about the 80s, you'd have seen most of it as being aesthetically quite conservative. There were sort of obviously new things. People like Cameron Brathwaite was doing new things in terms of sound and subject matter and so on. But in terms of perhaps most of the fiction that was around, you just describe most of it as being kind of quite autobiographical. There are loads of good kind of growing up stories. But often kind of quite, kind of. I always had a sense that there were only a small number of writers who had a sense of their whole societies. So people wrote about the bits they knew. So growing up in the country, you could write about growing up in the country. Growing up in town, you could write a bit about growing up in town. By and large, the kind of African Caribbean writers wrote about African Caribbean life, Indian Caribbeans wrote, and yet there were points where they kind of intersected. And I thought there were only a handful of writers at that kind of point who were technically sort of moving beyond that kind of. People like McElanthy write lovely books, but they're books which are close to a particular kind of experience.
I think like Alfred Mendes. He kind of crossed over a little bit.
Yes. In the sense, yes. So there is. There is that sense. There is always that sense of, particularly in some of those earliest books, not just writing about me growing up, but it's that kind of the kind of stranger. If C.L.R. James's Minty Alley, he's the middle class boy who rents space in the yard, and this is a world that is totally kind of alien to his whole bringing up. He knows it's the kind of world that his family abhors, and he finds and he writes about that because it's in a sense it was the underside of Trinidadian life, the majority life, but not the life that was ever getting into writing or recognised as being the source of cultural energies in Trinidad. It was the space where Steel Band came from. It was the space where Carnival came from. It was the space where Kaizo came from, and so on. So there is, there's one of the elements in the Caribbean has always perhaps been sometimes a sense of the writer. Most Caribbean writers have come, whatever their backgrounds, education is the major kind of route away from. It's the route out of the fields. It's the route out of the kind of the kind of very boring office job or basic commerce and things. So so that by and large, whether writers may have come from very kind of working class kind of education takes them away in some sense. So there is always a sense in Caribbean writing about the kind of the scholarship boy, or now the scholarship woman, who is looking at from a position via education, via access to the kind of the whole, there's a line in one of Jan Scheinborn's novels when she's a scholarship winner. She goes to the local grammar school in I think, and of course they learn English literature, and of course it's English literature, and they, so they're learning about, and that's part of every kind of Caribbean writer's kind of thing, so that when Kwame Dawes writes about his thing, it's discovery. It's an English teacher who does Manly Hopkins with them, and wow, what can you do with language, and it's those, so that you have to acknowledge then the inspiration is both, there is now a generation of Caribbean writers who know their third generation, they know the people who come before them, but it's also the kind of things where you study Manly Hopkins in school, or you study kind of Dylan, or what used to be Dylan Thomas was a big influence in quite a number of Caribbean poets. Walcott wrote some of his early poems, a straight Dylan Thomas kind of things. So there's that kind of thing. But I think before the current generation, I'd say something like Lamming was doing things. Lamming was trying to get that sense of history. So it's often writing that didn't have a sense of history. Lamming had a sense of history. Naipaul had a sense of history. Naipaul had a sense of, I think, a mistaken one, but one where he's trying to get to grips with the fact that Trinidad is a mixed up kind of segmented society. Wilson Harris had that kind of vision of kind of, so it's one that combines history, a sense of needing to move outside of your own ethnocentricity, and so on. But I think one of the kinds of, I suppose one of the things that gave it its strength, but it could have become a prison, was that kind of idea of Caribbean writing as becoming always literary. So there was, a reluctance to get into some of the other kinds of possibilities. It's only just now, for instance, that people are beginning to write serious Caribbean crime, despite the fact it's the thing which people talk about more than anything else. So that finding that, I'm pleased that we were part of that in doing Jacob Ross's Bone Readers book. That you could write you could use the conventions of the police procedural, but use them in ways that kind of exposes aspects of Caribbean being in ways that are profound, or you can create good characters who give people pleasurable reading experiences, but also make them think. And the same through with the speculative. It's always been there. For instance, Edgar Mittelholzer wrote quite a number of highly speculative novels, with kind of science fiction-y kind of elements in it, or kind of fables. I know that Karen, I think I pointed at it to look. She became very interested in Mittelholzer and what he'd done, and has written a bits about him and so on. So it's been there, but it's very interesting. That there are kind of people who are seeing ways of kind of both connecting it into different ways of telling stories, but ways that also connecting with elements in that are buried deep inside Caribbean societies. So that, for instance, the other kind of thing which people I think are very interested in now is what you could call the Caribbean Gothic. And you think, well, in fact, this is a return, because the Gothic really came out of the Caribbean. The kind of classic Caribbean, the classic novel of the Gothic, Monk Lewis's The Monk. Monk Lewis was a Jamaican plantation owner. Monk Lewis was very interested in all the things about zombies and things, and carried some of those elements come into his fiction. so the Caribbean was always seen at that kind of point as a place of that challenged the kind of the way the Gothic challenged the rational, the fact that you couldn't get away from those kinds of deeper kinds of kind of more emotional kind of things. So I think it's quite interesting that there are a number of contemporary Caribbean writers have kind of been exploring the Gothic through things like the kind of figures like the Lagahoo, the Susean, and so that of thinking those things which were perhaps slightly cosy in folk tales, that if you actually transplant them into contemporary Caribbean life, they can become quite scary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we've just published a collection of stories by a young Trinidadian woman called Brianne McIver. I think I can't remember what the title is. The Beastiness or something like. But it explores kind of. So there's a sort of middle class character who discovers he in fact is a Lagahoo, and he sort of wakes up and finds he's got human flesh on his hands, and it's kind of using kind of interesting and popular forms to explore realities, really.
Okay.
So I think you're right in saying yes, there were gaps, but I think there are people who are busy kind of expanding the range. In other words, that you think if you're a Caribbean writer, I can write in any kind of genre I want, and I think that's happening.
Behind the modern classic series.
The motivation was that, to start off with most of the stuff had gone long out of print. They were the books which kind of got me interested in and recognised as being the basis of contemporary Caribbean writing. And I always had the feeling that writers shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. In other words, one of the things that you kind of sometimes see about the Caribbean is that, say something like Lamming, he writes things and he almost writes as if there was nobody before him. This is his book he wrote in the mid-50s, but there was James before him. But you also recognise that probably he'd never seen those books because they were in a library in Trinidad, or they were and things like, so people didn't know about early Mittelholzer because the first book he wrote was in a warehouse in London that got bombed during the war. So there were only a handful of copies ever survived. So you recognise that there was a fragmented kind of access to a tradition, and so I always think that it's important that both serious readers and serious writers have access to that tradition, are challenged by it, for instance, you're sort of recognising that Mittelholzer was writing some really inventive kind of books at that time. A challenge to writers to write more inventive books sometimes. So it was, and I also was something that it's something I think I also learnt from someone like John LaRose. He was always very kind of clear about the political importance of knowing where things came from, not forgetting previous struggles, not losing sight of. So you weren't, you didn't imagine that there was nothing before you. You learned from the mistakes, you built on the successes, and I think that's, and it struck me as being kind of like a commercially kind of fairly sound kind of proposition, and it's been a decent kind of no runaway bestsellers, but it's been a decent, and it was also things like there were writers there that people had forgotten about. One of the writers I was personally very very kind of enthusiastic about was Garth St. Thomas. Garth St. Thomas, a Lucian novelist, published originally by Faber, and he writes these very very sort of cool, sort of family kind of things, where he explains nothing. He just presents. So you have to deduce everything. So there's a conversation that begins a novel. He doesn't tell you about who the people are, but if as soon as you tuned in, you recognise where these people are coming from in terms of class. You recognise where they're coming from in terms of race and ethnicity, without him having to tell you any of that stuff. And it also that, I mean, he was a bit unpopular at the time because he was telling hard
truths about society,
about the fact that people talked about decolonisation, but they weren't doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And they talked. So there's the very same people who talked about kind of black pride were also hunting after white women.
Okay.
So he was kind of pretty hot on the kind of levels of kind of self-deception, and I think when you read him now, you recognise that what he saw was that the process of decolonisation was always going to be a much longer one. It wasn't going to happen in a generation, because the people who were in charge of it had been educated in British colonial traditions. It was probably and it's only perhaps beginning to happen now.
Okay. What I found interesting, I was looking at your Facebook page a few months ago, I think it was, and I was really interested in what was published in terms of something warning us, or not necessarily me because I'm not a writer, but warning people to stay away from vanity publishers. Could you explain a little bit about that? Because there was something about you.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, I suspect that now it's nothing like as a kind of severe a trap as it used to be.
Okay.
But there was certainly a point where people who couldn't get published, through the sort of normal sort of submission processes, could get trapped up into the people who ran presses where they charged an awful lot of money. They claimed to do editorial work but didn't do anything very well. They claimed that they would market. So I mean, I know one of the writers we do publish, she told me about her father who'd spent £3,000 or £4,000 and got really nothing for it. So I mean, our kind of, so I mean, when we were printers, we would do books for other people, and we'd help them. But when somebody come along and say, "Will you do me 1,000 copies of my collection of poetry?" and we say, "We would, but I don't think it's a good idea." How many copies do you think you could sell? How are you going to sell them? Where are you going to sell them? How many friends have you got? How many people as members of your family will actually buy it? Where would you put 1,000 books? And you talk them down to doing 200 or 300 copies or something, and you still expect that probably half of those will still be in boxes somewhere. So I'm certainly think there's a very honourable tradition of self-publishing, and it's so much easier to do now. You can just you can use Lightning Source, you can use Amazon, and so on. And there's a significant amount of Caribbean self-publishing, and it doesn't cost that much. The problem is that it bypasses the editorial process. It bypasses the process where somebody will give you hard feedback. So that your best friend will always tell you it's marvellous. Yeah. They won't tell you that this bit's okay, but that bit's terrible, and you really need to rewrite that, and so on. So it's. I mean, on the one hand, I'd encourage anybody who wants to self-publish and they've got something they feel they want to say, but recognise that books should have an editorial process and so on. At the same time, I'd also say that there is an added value in a publishing company. The added value in the publishing company is that as well as kind of editing books, marketing books, you also in a sense curate books, so that you create relationships between books. And obviously one of the elements of the decision making process about whether you decide to publish a book or not publish a book is thinking about how it connects in with what you've already done, and also how does it fit into that growing body of Caribbean writing or Black British writing? Is it adding something to it? Is it is there something genuinely new in it? And that, of course, tends not to be a question that people who want to publish their own work ask themselves.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to know, for you, because you've been in this for such a long time now, if someone that hasn't explored Caribbean writing before,
mm-hmm.
what do you think that they will get from Caribbean writing that you don't necessarily get from anywhere else around the world?
I think, yeah. I think. I'm just about to go back to my own kind of things. I was very interested. This is student times. I was very interested in African writing, but I also kind of recognised that there was so much about the kind of context or the kind of out of which African writing came that I knew nothing about and didn't really perhaps have the means to know about it. Caribbean writing, you recognise that you're living in one of the parents of it, so that there is always a dialogue in Caribbean writing between that kind of the fact that the Caribbean remains sort of Eurocentric in its that is still the dominant cultural position in the Caribbean, but there is a dialogue going on with other elements of it. That there is always a dialogue in Jamaica between Europe and Africa in some kind of ways. So that and it's also recognising that kind of the Caribbean is part of British history in a very intimate kind of way. So one of the things, so I'll say something else in a minute, but perhaps one of the things that somebody coming to Caribbean writing would be one. There is the pleasure to be had from that kind of inventive use of Caribbean English, and the kind of that kind of continuum between Creoles and Patois and standard Caribbean English, which there's scarcely a decent Caribbean novel which doesn't do that in some kind of ways, and that kind of pleasurable recognition of how people come up with kind of those common Creole phrases. When it's raining heavily, it's bucket a drop, and so there is all that kind of inventiveness of language that is there. It's kind of it's writing about societies which are struggling with their own history. There is about societies which are struggling with their own diversities. So it's sort of recognising the Caribbean has been in a place for the last 300 or 400 years, which we're just beginning to get to grips with for ourselves in Britain, or trying to turn our backs on in terms of Brexit and those kind of things. So I think also that I think Caribbean writers recognise they come out of a tradition of storytelling. So I think that there are a few novels which don't have a decent emphasis on telling a good story. So So I think those are some of the kind of things why you think dip in, find out. There are pleasures to be had, and and I think move beyond the big names. And you'd find lots of pleasures and understanding. Yeah.
It's interesting you said move beyond the big names. So I'm thinking emerging writers or current writers coming out of your publishing house. Who are some of the writers that you think people should explore or maybe even titles that you think people should read?
Well, I mean, just in terms of people whose work does seem to begun to cross over out of. I mean, like Jacob Ross's work has begun to is doing that. So that the Digger novels. I mean, we've sold on that for him to work with a much bigger publisher to see what can be done with it, really. But yeah, so that's kind of one thing of telling stories about a small island police force, a kind of and all the kinds of sort of characters he's invented. I mean that's one thing. One of the books with collection of stories we've done recently is Leonie Ross. They're not related in any sense, and her book Come Let Us Sing Anyway was featured on, what was the programme, Hal?
A Good Read.
And we sold 2 or 3 thousand copies on the basis of the enthusiasm of the people who were doing that. Most of whom were, there was Bernadine on it or something?
Bernadine Everest recommended it.
Recommended it. So there is still a fact that for books by black authors to get anywhere, they need some kind, they need the support of somebody who has opened the door. So somebody like Bernadine Evaristo is very important. If Bernadine says, I want to review this book, then the Guardian will listen. But it's often needing that kind of support. The book, the books can make the way in that kind of way. I mean, just to give you an example, a long time ago, we won the Forward Prize with Kwame Dawes's Progeny of That. Why did we win it? It's a really good book, poetry collection. We also won it because the chair of the judges that year was Jean Binter-Breeze. Jean Binter-Breeze was able to kind of persuade the other judges, look, this is a book you should take seriously. And they would say, well, it's a book about religion. It's got religion in it. It's Jamaican. You can't write a book about Jamaica without acknowledging the big people, sort of. And was able to do it. Then there was a long kind of silence. And I think then suddenly, like the Forward Prize, the Poetry Prize, began to recognise that it was failing miserably in terms of its recognition of diverse voices. And so they started to do things like they invited Malika Booker to become a chair. They've had other people, and then suddenly you find books by black authors are getting serious consideration, but it often needs that kind of explanation, advocacy to open those doors.
What do you think have been your best moments in publishing, and what do you love about your work most? There have been a lot of
best moments, really. There have been few bad moments. Very few bad moments, and they've not really been to do with publishing. They've been more to do with economics. The chief pleasure is it's a kind of intellectual, creative enjoyment from working with imaginative writers, and I think genuinely helping them to make their books better than they were originally. And that's I've probably written about 2 or 3 poems in my entire life. Not bad, but but they kind of like very kind of out of specific kind of moments. I've never written fiction. I think it would be appalling. I think anything I wrote would be not good. I have ideas every so often, but don't actually, follow them through. But so I don't have that kind of writerly kind of thing. But I think what I have is the ability to get in really close to what a writer is doing. We never try and change it from what it's trying to be. That's and that's one of the things I think that's specific to, I think quite often small presses work. That they respect what somebody's doing. You wouldn't accept it otherwise, but then you try and make it consistent as good as it could be. And that sometimes might involve you rewriting a whole paragraph. It might, and the kind of when you've succeeded, is sometimes at a launch event somebody might read from the book and think, actually I wrote that back, or whether somebody says, I can't remember now which bits you redraft and things. So there's a kind of there's a kind of element of being able to try and find some being able to hear somebody's voice, so that when you edit, edit is mostly about taking stuff out, but sometimes it's sometimes about recognizing, no, everybody goes to sleep sometimes, so sometimes a writer kind of goes to sleep and no, that character wouldn't say that at that point there, and they wouldn't. So it's being a close and attentive reader, respecting what somebody's trying to do, but then sort of pushing them towards being consistent.
Okay.
And I mean the thing you do most of that is you stop writers explaining all the damn time.
Okay. Very last question. I just wanted to ask, what do you want your legacy to be? Well,
it's a significant question, because I'm at the stage now where I am thinking about retirement. I'm probably I'm 72 now. I'll probably go, but we run out of an Arts Council cycle in 2000. I'll be 76 when that comes. I think at that stage I may want to retire from daily work. I may want to do some other things. Well, I got one or two ideas for books I want to write, not creative books, but sort of things. I think, to some extent, so that one of the issues that we're kind of struggling with at the minute is working out how to ensure some kind of continuity. How to keep the thing going. But also that I made a family commitment that I will retire. So at that stage, I owe some time back. That's the sort of thing. There have been things where the legacy has already, in a sense, been recognised. The University of West Indies, Jamaica gave me an on dealer and stuff like that. Bocas gave me a Henry Swansea kind of thing. So I think you can feel the satisfaction that significant people recognise the value of what you've done. I've always known the value of it, but it's nice to get the pat on the back sometimes and the acknowledgement from other people that it's there. So I suppose that there's a challenge there somewhere as well. Somebody to pick up those kind of reins. One of the problems is, I think kind of being an editor is a particular kind of frame of mind, frame of way of looking at things. I was going to tell you about this. Yes, the Commonwealth Foundation at one point decided that they were going to try and support the development of literary infrastructure in the Caribbean. So they gave some support to Bocas. They gave some support to sort of organisations for trying to look at how you could join things up a bit more. We got into a thing where we worked together with an American publisher called Akashic to form a kind of a company called Pcash, with the idea that Pcash would do anthologies that largely focus on new writing, and that very largely focus on people who are actually based in the Caribbean. And that then at some stage we would hand Pcash over and hope it would survive, and so there's that kind of you think one of the things you do learn is that we ran a course for editors from right across the region, but when you scratch a little bit, what you discover is they all want to be writers. They don't actually want to be editors. So there is that kind of slight problem, but I think somebody will emerge and will be prepared to sort of perhaps sacrifice their own writing because they think it's important to do that. But we'll see. We'll see what comes.